Let me tell you something. In all the legal chaos that surrounds Donald Trump, and trust me, there has been a lot of it, this particular story might be one of the most fascinating, most self-destructive, and honestly most entertaining legal disasters I have ever seen unfold in real time. Because this isn't just a story about a lawsuit. This is a story about a man who thought he could bully one of the most powerful and respected media institutions on the planet, and instead ended up handing them a loaded weapon and pointing it directly at himself. So grab a seat because I'm going to walk you through every single layer of this, from how it started, to why it's collapsing, to what it could ultimately cost Donald Trump. And trust me, by the end of this, you're going to understand exactly why the people around him should have talked him out of this the moment he brought it up. How this all started. To understand why this lawsuit is such a disaster, you first need to understand what actually happened and why Trump decided to file it in the first place. It was a BBC News story, a story covering the events of January 6, 2021, the day that the United States Capitol was stormed by a mob of Trump supporters following his rally near the White House. Now, the BBC, like pretty much every major news organization in the world, covered that day extensively. And inside one of their reports, they used a video clip of Donald Trump. But here's the thing, that clip was edited. And according to Trump's legal team, that 12-second edit was done in a way that misrepresented what Trump actually said and did that day. His lawyers argued that the edit made it appear as though Trump was actively encouraging and inciting the violence that followed, when in reality, at least according to Trump, he was calling for peace and a lawful, orderly process. Now, reasonable people can absolutely disagree about what Trump said and meant on January 6th. That debate has been going on for years. But Trump didn't just want to issue a statement or demand a correction. He didn't just want an apology. No. Donald Trump decided that the appropriate response to a 12-second video edit was to file a $10 billion lawsuit against the BBC, $10 billion. And right from the start, legal experts looked at this and raised their eyebrows. Because this wasn't just an aggressive legal move. This was a move that was going to open up a Pandora's box that Trump would have absolutely no control over. But we'll get to that. First, let's talk about why Trump probably thought this was a good idea. Why Trump thought this would work. Here's the thing you have to understand about the way Donald Trump has used lawsuits throughout his career. For him, litigation has often been less about winning in court and more about using the legal process as a weapon. File a massive lawsuit, make it expensive, make it stressful, make the other side feel the pressure of facing billion-dollar claims and mountains of legal paperwork, and then wait for them to settle, to write a check, issue a statement, maybe a quiet apology, just to make the whole thing go away. And that strategy has worked for him before. We've seen it with media organizations, with individuals, with business partners. The threat of expensive, drawn-out litigation is often enough to get people to fold, especially when the person on the other side of the table is Donald Trump, a man with nearly unlimited resources to keep a legal battle going indefinitely. And there was probably another calculation happening here too. Trump has shown a pattern of filing lawsuits against media organizations as a way of sending a message, not just to the specific target, but to every other outlet watching. A kind of warning. Mess with me, edit my words, cover me in a way I don't like, and this is what happens to you. We've seen CBS settle. We've seen other organizations bend the knee, as they say, and essentially capitulate rather than fight. The goal was probably the same here. But here's where Trump made a critical miscalculation. The BBC is not CBS. The BBC is not an American company. It is a British institution, one of the most respected and established media organizations in the entire world, with a global reputation built over decades. And most importantly, the Trump administration has zero regulatory power over the BBC. None. He cannot threaten their broadcast license. He cannot have the FCC come after them. He cannot use the power of his office to apply pressure the way he might be able to with American outlets. The BBC operates completely outside his sphere of influence. So when Trump filed this lawsuit, instead of getting a panicked phone call from BBC executives looking to settle, he got something very different. He got a legal team that looked at this case, looked at their options, and decided, we're going to fight back. And we're going to fight back hard. The BBC fights back. And it's brutal now. Here is where the story really starts to get good. Because the BBC didn't just hire lawyers to defend themselves. They went on full offense. And the tool they used to do it is something called discovery. Let me explain what discovery is, because understanding this is absolutely essential to understanding why this lawsuit is such a nightmare for Trump right now. When a lawsuit is filed, both sides have the legal right to demand information from each other before the case goes to trial. This process is called discovery, and it is extraordinarily powerful. Through discovery, you can demand documents, you can demand financial records, you can require people to sit down and answer questions under oath in what's called a deposition. And here's the really important part. Discovery doesn't just apply to the people who are actually part of the lawsuit. Through a legal tool called a subpoena, you can compel third parties, people and organizations who have nothing to do with the case, to hand over documents or give testimony as well. And the BBC has weaponized discovery in a way that should make everyone in Trump's inner circle extremely uncomfortable. As of right now, the BBC has issued 47 subpoenas. 47. To people and entities inside Trump's world. We're talking about family members, close advisors, business associates, people like Steve Bannon, financial institutions that have done business with Trump, the trust that holds Trump's personal assets. All of them are now receiving legal demands for documents and testimony, and they cannot simply say no. A subpoena is not a request, it is a legal order. You comply or you face consequences from the court. And the brilliance of the BBC's strategy here is that they've organized their entire discovery effort around three very specific and very devastating pillars. Three areas where they are going to dig deep, demand answers, and force Trump's world to open up in ways that could be extraordinarily damaging, not just to this lawsuit, but potentially far beyond it. Pillar 1, the reputation damage claim. Let's start with the first pillar, because this one is almost poetic in its irony. Trump's central claim in this lawsuit is that the BBC's coverage caused him irreparable damage to his reputation. That this 12-second edit was so harmful, so defamatory, so damaging to how the world sees him, that it cost him billions of dollars and destroyed the public image he had spent decades building. Okay, fine, that's his claim. But here's the problem. The BBC gets to challenge that claim. They get to investigate it, they get to demand evidence that his reputation was actually damaged. And one of their most powerful arguments against this claim is almost laughably simple. Donald Trump won the 2024 presidential election. Think about that for a second. Trump is standing in court arguing that this BBC story was so devastating to his reputation that he deserves $10 billion in compensation. And at the same time, he just won the most powerful election in the world by approximately 5 million votes. His reputation was so catastrophically destroyed that tens of millions of Americans looked at him and said, yeah, that's our guy, let's make him president again. The BBC's lawyers are going to stand up in that courtroom and say, if your reputation was truly ruined, if this coverage truly devastated how the world sees you, how do you explain winning a presidential election? How do you explain the fact that your public support didn't collapse? It actually grew. How do you explain being the most powerful man on the planet right now? And that's just the beginning of the reputation pillar, because through their subpoenas, the BBC is also going to be asking people in Trump's orbit, his family members, his advisors, his business partners, to testify about how this coverage actually affected him, how it affected his mood, his business dealings, his relationships, his state of mind. All of that is now on the table. All of it is now subject to legal scrutiny, because Trump made it part of his claim. Pillar 2, January 6th, all over again. Now here is where things get truly extraordinary, and I mean that in the most serious way possible. Trump's lawsuit claims that the BBC cast him in a false light regarding January 6th, that the edited clip misrepresented his role in the events of that day, that the way it was presented made him look like someone who wanted violence when he allegedly did not. Okay, so here's what that means legally. If Trump is arguing that the BBC got January 6th wrong, that the truth about that day paints him in a more favorable light than the BBC suggested, then the BBC has every right to go and find out what the truth actually is. They have the legal right to conduct their own thorough private investigation into exactly what happened on January 6th, 2021. And that is exactly what they are doing. The BBC's legal team is subpoenaing documents connected to January 6th investigations. They are seeking materials tied to former special counsel Jack Smith's investigation. They are essentially conducting a private, court-sanctioned investigation into one of the most consequential days in modern American political history. And they're doing it because Donald Trump handed them the legal justification to do so by filing this lawsuit. Think about the irony of that. The January 6th investigations that Trump spent years fighting, obstructing, and trying to shut down, the investigations he celebrated when they were wound down, are now effectively being reopened in a private legal context. Except this time, it's not Congress doing it, it's not the Justice Department doing it, it's the BBC's lawyers doing it, and they're doing it because he sued them. Every witness they depose, every document they obtain, every piece of evidence they uncover about what really happened on January 6th, all of it is going to come out in the context of this lawsuit. A lawsuit that Trump chose to file. A lawsuit that he is in complete control of, meaning he could drop it at any time. But for now, it continues. And for now, the discovery into January 6th continues with it. Pillar 3, follow the money, and then there's the third pillar. And for my money, pun fully intended, this might be the most dangerous one of all for Donald Trump. Trump's lawsuit claims that the BBC's coverage cost him billions of dollars in financial harm. That this story damaged him not just reputationally, but economically. That he lost real money, massive amounts of money, as a direct result of what the BBC published. Okay, so here's the legal reality of that claim. The moment you tell a court that someone caused you financial harm, you open your finances up to scrutiny. The other side gets to look at your financial records. They get to examine your investments, your revenue streams, your business dealings, your assets. Because because they have the right to independently verify whether the financial damage you're claiming is actually real. And in Trump's case, this is particularly explosive, because the BBC is not just looking at his general finances. They are specifically subpoenaing the trust that holds Trump's personal assets, a trust that was set up when he became president, reportedly to create separation between his personal wealth and his presidential duties, and which is said to be managed by his son, Don Jr. Now, Donald Trump has spent years, his entire political career really, fiercely protecting his financial information. He fought lengthy legal battles to keep his tax returns private. He has consistently refused to provide detailed financial disclosures. His financial dealings have always been one of the most closely guarded secrets around him. And now, because he filed a $10 billion lawsuit claiming financial harm, the BBC's lawyers have a court-sanctioned right to go digging. The trust, the investments, the business dealings, the financial relationships, all of it is potentially on the table now. And there is absolutely nothing Trump can do about it, because he's the one who put it there by making financial damages a central part of his claim. The missed deadline, a legal catastrophe. Now, as if all of that wasn't bad enough, let's talk about what's happening procedurally in this case right now, because this part of the story is almost as damaging as everything else, and it speaks to the absolute chaos surrounding Trump's legal representation in this matter. The BBC filed what is called a motion to dismiss this lawsuit. A motion to dismiss is exactly what it sounds like. It's a formal legal argument asking the judge to throw the case out entirely before it even gets to trial. The BBC's motion laid out multiple powerful arguments for why this lawsuit should not be allowed to proceed. No personal jurisdiction in Florida. The story was never broadcast in the United States. The actual malice standard applies and cannot be met, and others. When a motion to dismiss is filed, the other side, in this case Trump's legal team, has a deadline to file a response. This response is called an opposition brief, and it is one of the most critical documents in any lawsuit. It is Trump's legal team's opportunity to stand up and say, here is why this case should not be dismissed. Here are our arguments. Here is our evidence. Here is why we deserve the right to keep this lawsuit alive. The judge set the deadline for this response as June 5th. Trump's lawyers missed it. They simply did not file. The deadline came and went with no response from Trump's side, no opposition brief, nothing. Now I want you to understand just how serious this is. In the legal world, missing a deadline on a dispositive motion, a motion that can end your entire case, is not just a minor procedural hiccup. It is a catastrophic failure. It is the kind of mistake that can get a case thrown out by default. It is the kind of mistake that, if made by an attorney representing a regular client, would constitute malpractice. It is simply not something that competent legal teams allow to happen. When the judge found out, he issued a stern warning about potential sanctions. Sanctions are financial penalties that courts can impose on parties or their lawyers for failing to follow court rules and deadlines. The judge was essentially saying, this is unacceptable, and if you don't explain yourself, there will be consequences. So Trump's legal team finally responded. And their explanation, I want you to hear this carefully, their explanation was essentially this. We did write the opposition brief. We even sent a draft of it to the BBC's lawyers, but we haven't officially filed it with the court yet because there are some issues around a protective order that we're still working out, and also because we sent the deposition transcripts to President Trump, and he needs time to read them and review our motion. He's a very busy man. He's a very busy man. That was their excuse to a federal judge, that the President of the United States, who, again, chose to file this lawsuit, who chose to make this a legal battle, who chose to claim $10 billion in damages, didn't have time to read the papers. I want to be fair here. They did mention other reasons too. Issues around the protective order, around how certain sealed documents should be handled, those are real legal considerations. But at the end of the day, none of that changes the fundamental reality. You missed the deadline. And in law, deadlines are sacred. When you know you're going to have trouble meeting a deadline, you go to the court in advance and formally request an extension. Or you reach out to opposing counsel. Because lawyers, even in the most heated battles, are often professional enough to grant each other reasonable extensions. You don't just let the deadline pass and then tell the judge your client was too busy to do his homework. The jurisdiction problem. Nobody's talking about enough now while all of this is happening, the subpoenas, the missed deadline, the January 6th discovery. There's another massive problem lurking underneath this entire lawsuit that I don't think gets discussed enough. And that's the question of whether this case should even be in a Florida court in the first place. The BBC is a British company. They are headquartered in the United Kingdom. They have no significant operations in the state of Florida. The story in question was produced in the United Kingdom. It was broadcast in the United Kingdom. It was not broadcast in the United States. It was not available on American streaming streaming platforms like BritBox. For all practical purposes, this story had essentially zero footprint in the state of Florida specifically. And yet, Trump's lawyers filed this lawsuit in Florida, and the BBC's legal team is arguing, correctly in the view of many legal experts, that Florida courts simply have no jurisdiction over them. No what's called personal jurisdiction, meaning no legal authority over the BBC as an entity. No general jurisdiction, because the BBC is not based or incorporated in Florida. And the attempt by Trump's team to point to a BBC-related subsidiary that happens to have some presence in Florida is being challenged as insufficient to establish the kind of connection needed to justify bringing this case there. This is a fundamental, foundational problem. Because if the court agrees with the BBC that there is no jurisdiction in Florida, the entire case gets thrown out. Not on the merits, not because of the evidence, but simply because it was filed in the wrong place. And that would be yet another embarrassing and entirely self-inflicted wound for Trump's legal team. The actual malice problem. And then there's one more legal mountain that Trump has to climb, and it might be the steepest one of all. In American defamation law, there is a critically important distinction between public figures and private citizens. Private citizens who are defamed have a relatively straightforward path to winning a defamation case. They generally just need to show that false statements were made about them that caused harm. But public figures, and this is key, public figures have to meet a much higher standard. They have to prove what's called actual malice. Actual malice means that the person who published the allegedly defamatory statement either knew it was false at the time they published it, or acted with reckless disregard for whether it was true or false. And Donald Trump is not just a public figure. He is arguably the most public figure in the entire world, the sitting president of the United States, a man who has been in the global spotlight for decades. There is no question whatsoever that the actual malice standard applies to him. So Trump's legal team would have to prove in court that BBC journalists knew at the time they published that 12-second edit that it was false. Not that they made a mistake, not that they were careless, not that a reasonable editor might have made a different choice. They would have to prove that the BBC knowingly, intentionally published something they knew to be false with the deliberate intent to harm Trump's reputation. That is an extraordinarily difficult standard to meet, especially against an organization like the BBC, which has extensive editorial processes, experienced journalists, and a long institutional history of defending their editorial decisions. The BBC's internal records, their editorial communications, their decision-making process around that story, all of it would have to point to deliberate, knowing falsehood. And based on everything we know about how this story was produced and published, that kind of evidence is essentially non-existent. What happens next, and how this ends. So let's put all of this together, because I think the picture is now very clear. Donald Trump filed a $10 billion lawsuit against the BBC thinking they would fold. They didn't. Instead, they came back with 47 subpoenas targeting his reputation claims, his financial records, and his conduct on January 6th. His lawyers missed a critical court deadline and told the judge his client was too busy to deal with it. The jurisdiction arguments against this case are serious and potentially fatal to the lawsuit on their own. The actual malice standard is going to be nearly impossible to meet, and the motion to dismiss, the one Trump's team couldn't be bothered to respond to on time, is still sitting there, waiting to potentially end this entire case before it ever gets close to a trial. And here's what I think is happening right now behind closed doors in Trump's legal circle. I think there are very serious conversations happening about how to get out of this. Because the reality is, every single day this lawsuit continues, the BBC's lawyers get to dig deeper. Every deposition they take, every document they subpoena, every piece of financial information they uncover, all of it potentially becomes part of the public record. All of it potentially exposes things that Trump has spent years and enormous resources trying to keep hidden. The smart move, the strategic move, would be to find what lawyers sometimes call a graceful exit strategy, a way to walk away from this lawsuit without it looking like a complete and total defeat. Maybe Trump's team files a motion to voluntarily dismiss the case and frames it as a strategic decision. Maybe they reach some kind of private agreement with the BBC that allows both sides to save face. Maybe Trump goes on social media and declares some kind of imaginary victory before quietly dropping the whole thing. Because here's what's not going to happen. This case is not going to result in a $10 billion judgment against the BBC. It's not going to happen. The legal foundations of this lawsuit are too weak, the procedural problems are too serious, the discovery exposure is too damaging, and the BBC is clearly too committed to fighting back for Trump to ever get what he originally claimed he wanted. The bigger lesson here. And I think there's a broader lesson in all of this that goes beyond just this one lawsuit. Donald Trump has built a significant part of his political identity around the idea that he fights back, that he never backs down, that he hits harder than anyone who hits him. And for a long time, that image, combined with the genuine legal and financial resources to back it up, was enough to intimidate a lot of people into compliance. But the BBC case is a perfect example of what happens when that strategy runs into an opponent who has the resources, the resolve, and the legal standing to simply refuse to be intimidated. The BBC didn't panic. They didn't reach out quietly to settle. They didn't write a check and issue an apology. They looked at this lawsuit, they understood exactly what it was, a pressure campaign dressed up in legal clothing, and they responded by turning the pressure right back around. And now, instead of the BBC being on the defensive, it's Trump's legal team that's missing deadlines, scrambling to respond to 47 subpoenas, trying to figure out how to protect decades of financial records, and explaining to a federal judge why the President of the United States was too busy to deal with the lawsuit that the President of the United States chose to file. Be careful what you wish for. That's the lesson. And Donald Trump is learning it in the most expensive and most public way possible. Final thoughts. Here's where I land on all of this. This lawsuit is going to end one of two ways. Either the motion to dismiss gets granted, possibly very soon, given that Trump's team couldn't even respond to it on time, and the case gets thrown out entirely, or Trump's people quietly find a way to walk away, claim some kind of victory that exists only in their own press releases, and hope that everyone forgets this ever happened. What is not going to happen is Trump winning $10 billion from the BBC. What is not going to happen is the BBC being silenced or punished. What is already happening, right now, today, is that the BBC's legal team is sitting in deposition rooms and filing offices, methodically pulling back the curtain on Trump's finances, his conduct on January 6th, and the real-world impact of his claimed reputational damage. He sued the BBC to punish them, and instead, he gave them a legal hunting license. That's the story. That's the reality. And I'll be watching this case every step of the way, because something tells me it's going to get even more interesting before it's over. Stay tuned. This one is far from finished.